Hi, my name is César Hidalgo. I run the Center for Collective Learning at the University of Toulouse and Corvinus University in Budapest. And I'm very excited to present you today a work that started originally outside academia, but then motivated some pretty interesting work that is helping us understand how people express, preferences in a collective setting. This work started more or less on 2019. What happened is that in Chile in 2019, there was a relatively large revolution. In a matter of a couple of days, even maybe overnight, almost half of the subway network of Santiago was burned or destroyed. A number of supermarkets, and other businesses were looted and destroyed as well. And that started a process that eventually ended in a new constitutional process that started on November 15 of 2019. That process is still actually ongoing and has not been very successful so far. And that process started not because people were protesting peacefully on the streets, but because there were massive mobilizations that triggered a rethinking of the political landscape, the social contract that existed between society and the government. And there was a moment really when this was chaos. It was a week that started relatively normal on October of 2019, and that started to escalate. On Thursday, there were a few protests on the subway. On Friday, the mobilizations grew, and on Saturday, people woke up to a city that had been really, devastated by some of these mobilizations. And from then, they started to have confrontations between the police, and the mobilized population in a way that was actually quite chaotic. And within that context, I was, as a Chilean living in Boston at that time, I was also worried, because I understood that what we were having there was what we know in the literature as a network social movement. These have become quite common, especially, after 2009, 2010. And these are movements that have certain characteristics. They are movements that distrust political parties. So in some sense, they're not movements that have a clear leader. They distrust traditional media. They also tend to reiterate this idea that they don't believe the media, what the media is doing. They reject formal forms of organization. They reject traditional leadership. And what happens with these movements is that they're very fast, when it comes to growth. They can grow very quickly. There can be millions of people that join these mobilizations. But what do these people want tends to be unclear. So one of the symptoms of the network social movement phenomena is that their grievances tend to be quite unclear. So I was in Boston, at my company, and we started to think that could we do something to help articulate these grievances? What were people really upset about? So among other things, I participated, I'm still part of a think tank in Chile that involves many people that actually have, political experience, much more political experience than I do, people that have been former ministers or people that have worked, for long, in some sort of relationship with the Chilean government. So I sent a message on WhatsApp to the group, and I said, look, we're trying to build a platform together with my company DataWheel, in which people are going to be able to compare different policy items. Can you give me ideas of what we should include there? And then basically I start getting like a flood of messages from different people, from this think tank, giving me ideas of what they thought could be some of the things that actually, were behind, this massive mobilization. So then I grabbed those grievances, and then we grabbed the team, and literally overnight, we started on a Wednesday morning, and we launched a platform on Thursday morning, the next day, to help organize, to help understand what people were mobilized about. So what was the platform that we did? The platform that we did was called, at that moment, Chilecracia. Here's the tweet where I released it. I was inviting people to participate in Chilecracia, a new platform where people can rank collectively over 80 citizen proposals that were compiled from social networks and expert groups. And this first image actually is quite interesting because the platform is not about what we should do or anything. It's how you should prioritize things. It's just about preferences. It's not about actions. There's nothing binding. There's nothing actionable here. But in the preferences, the first one that I chose to put this out was, what do you prioritize? A new constitution for Chile or increasing the minimum wage? And this is very emblematic because a new constitution is an example of institutional reform, where a minimum wage was an example of an economic grievance about poverty and so forth. So I was putting in contrast these two ideas, but of course, in reality, there were over 80 proposals there. So the platform was optimized for mobile and looked more or less like this on your phone. Very simple. What would you prioritize? You get a couple of options. You click on one of them, you get the next one, and so forth. And we had experience building platforms of that type. Like actually we knew quite a bit about this type of preference elicitation systems, because over the previous decade at MIT, we had developed a platform called Place Pools that then led us to develop computer vision algorithms to classify images, from cities based on their perceived qualities, perceived safety, perceived liveliness, and so forth. So we knew how to work with this data, and we had some ideas on how to analyze it. And we also knew that this idea was not new. Actually, this idea of pair comparisons goes back to Louis Leon Thurstone. He's a very famous American psychologist, which in 1927, publishes this law of comparative judgment and uses a very similar example. In this case, is a pen and paper example in which people had to underline the offense they considered worst, in a list of crimes, and he's able to create these scales of how serious a crime is, based on these pair comparisons. So he's able to transform the qualitative into quantitative using this exact methodology. So we had a methodology that we believe was good and useful. And what this allowed us to do is in some way, put all of these proposals that I had received, there were 90 in the first version, that we released, basically provide a card and provide the ability for multiple people to start not only looking at these cards, but sorting them. So we were allowing people to sort a list with thousands of hands simultaneously on the web, sorting those hands, and also in a platform in which they could not talk to each other in that platform, and therefore they could not fight in that platform. They could fight about it elsewhere. There's a lot of places to fight on the internet, like Twitter and Facebook and comment sections. But in this case, you were kind of like forced to collaborate in this design. So what this allowed us to do technically is to run 4,000 simultaneous pairwise elections. So this is a way to scale participation, because with these 90 proposals, if you do 90 choose 2, you get a number that is a little bit over 4,000. Basically, that would be the number of head-to-head elections that we would be running between these issues, but we could run them all in parallel by using this type of design. So later that week, on Friday, I published kind of like a list. We had received at that time 300,000 votes. These are not people, because people, remember, can vote in multiple pairs. They're actually voting in about like 30 pairs on average. But we start getting kind of like a list, and you see, for example, that people want jail for people that have been in collusion crimes. They want a better minimum pension, a universal health care. And there, at this moment, in number 9, you see like the new constitution for Chile. Number 13, you see the minimum wage. But the platform really went viral, and it went viral many times. So here we have the hourly users that we got over these 3 weeks in which this platform became viral. So we released the first version there around October 24. Then we had articles in some newspapers and so forth. The traffic was stable. And what happened is that October 31st, basically for Halloween, there were 2 things that happened. We were featured on the cover of a very popular newspaper, and then there was a long weekend in Chile, and I prepared a package of video that I shared with journalists that had asked me for video. And this started to appear recurrently in television. So it appeared in television several times, and that would bring peaks of traffic. So we had about 200,000 people that came in to participate. Now, as the time went by, I started to realize that maybe this idea of organizing things around preferences was not a great idea. My original motivation to do this is like, look, I'm pretty sure that people in Chile that are in the left, that are in the right, they disagree on some things, but they must agree on a lot of things, so maybe if we make a platform that shows these agreements, like the things that people really share, we might help, find some consensus. And in reality, we did find quite a lot of consensus, but the items in which people disagreed on, we found that the disagreement was very hard. So by November 7, I created this chart that I shared on social media at that time, where you see the ranking of the items that were in the platform among people that identify with the left and people that identify with the right. We had a little survey that asked people to self-report whether they identify as someone from the left or someone from the right. And what you see in this chart, for instance, is that, yes, there is a big area of agreement. So everything that is in diagonal, it ranks more or less the same in the left than in the right. So for example, they want to cap the salary of politicians, or they want to improve minimum wage, or they want the minimum pension to be better. Those are things that the people in the left and right think are important. People don't think that, for example, is important, at this moment during the mobilization, to have more bicycle lanes as a policy priority. But there were things that people kind of disagreed on, and there were things that people really disagreed on. So, for example, here, if you look at the top left of that chart, you see Asamblea Constituyente. You probably understand that that means Constitutional Assembly, and you see that that is a proposal that is ranked in the top 10 among people on the left. The number one among people on the left is the new constitution, but it's ranked, less than 100 in people on the right. So there's a huge disagreement about that topic, And one of the things that actually people started to complain is why the new constitution was not number one. Because, of course, it was number one among their group, but their group was not the whole country. Their group was the group of people that basically were mobilized thinking that this was a political thing. And there were other people that were thinking that it was not a political thing, that maybe this was more of an economic, and social crisis. So even though the platform went viral, as you can imagine, we got a lot of people that didn't like it, or that were suspicious, like actually, because we came out so quickly during the mobilization, there were all of these conspiracy theories of where we came from. Here is just a screen grab from one of the newspaper comment sections. Why do you publish these dirty communists? Did they publish your father? No, yours. Someone says, yes, I participated, but I think that this is a Trojan horse from the left. So there were all of these theories that, our platform that we had developed in that basement on Cambridge, Massachusetts, was something that had been done by the Chavez regime. There were other people that saying that this was a CIA tool designed to destabilize the mobilization. In reality, there were 5 guys with a laptop, trying to do their best. So this was more or less the timeline. We had this first student protests, then, the next day, the 70 plus subway stations were damaged, burned, and so forth. There's a curfew that is declared for the first time in Chile since the times of Pinochet. We decided to build the platform. We launched the platform. And then for about 3 weeks, this platform, it's active, it's out there. And eventually the mobilizations become so big that Santiago becomes a battlefield, and the government decide to sign an agreement to start a new constitution in a blank page. That in Chilean history is like 100 years ago by now, because so much happened in between, but it was a very, very, very dense period of our history. So that's kind of like how these ideas got started. At that time, I was teaching at the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard. I was teaching a course in the Master in Design Engineering. And then I had a bunch of students there that I told them this, like, let me tell you what I did last weekend, and I told them about this thing that we had done in Chile. And they told me, well, we're having protests in Lebanon too. We're having protests in Georgia. There's some protests coming in Colombia. So we did a few replications, and we basically, provided the technology, and then they launched their platforms in these other places. But then we needed to understand what was going on. We were having all of this participation. We had people tell us, how they thought about, not about politicians, not about parties, but about actual issues, which was really interesting, but to understand that, we needed to then, get a little bit more into academia and try to start from the point of where other people have started, which is social choice theory. This is the science of how to aggregate individual preferences into collective decisions. So for the most part, social theories have focused on consensus and agreement. This is a very old discipline. It goes back to before the French Revolution. People like Nicolas de Condorcet, who was actually, the president of the Second Constitutional Assembly of France during the revolutionary times, invented one of the most famous voting rules, Marquis de Jean-Charles Borda. He also did voting rule based on rank-based voting, which is kind of popular today. People like to talk about rank-based voting. These are things that go back a long time, and they tend to focus on agreement. They tend to ask the question, if I have a lot of preferences from people, how do I add them up to understand which one is the winner, which one is second, which one is third, and so forth, but mostly who is the winner? Is this a fair winner or not? And to do that, what you would do in theory is you would use axiomatic properties. Okay, so for instance, you have this idea of Condorcet, which is like the winner of an election is the one that would have won every pairwise election. So you have an election of 7 candidates. You can pair each one of those candidates in an election that involves only 2 of them, and the candidate that wins all the elections that only involve 2 candidates is the fair winner. You have also the tyrant of the majority, which is this idea that you don't want a voting rule or a system in which people that have 51% can put their foot on the 49%. You also have the idea of independence of irrelated alternatives. You have an election between 3 candidates, and there's one candidate that is clearly not going to win. You don't want that candidate that is clearly not going to win change the outcome of the election. Like happened with Ralph Nader in 2000 in the US election. So you have these axiomatic properties, and you look for a voting rule that gives you a winner and satisfy these constraints. The problem with that is that you cannot have it all. Arrow, who won a Nobel Prize, in economics, has an impossibility theorem that says that if you have an election with 3 or more candidates, you cannot satisfy simultaneously these 4 axiomatic properties: independence of irrelative alternatives, Pareto efficiency, and restricted domain. This is the idea that any possible, ranking of preferences could be submitted. And non-dictatorship, this is the idea that someone cannot, let's say, vote last and choose the outcome of the election by being the last one to vote. But in the world that we're in, we know that we cannot have it all. But we're going to ask ourselves, how close can we get to having it? So sure, when you look at axiomatic properties, you get yes or no answers. This is math, and math sometimes is a little bit square. And in reality, we do care about the differences, because having an election that is 99% Condorcet efficient and one that is 20% Condorcet efficient is very different, even though both of them do not satisfy the axiomatic property. So we're going to ask ourselves, how close can we get to these axiomatic properties, not whether we satisfy them in a yes or no fashion. Now, the problem that we had is that all of this story that I told you so far, happened, in the basement of this unit in Cambridge, Massachusetts. DataWheel, which is a company that I founded in 2013, it specializes in data distribution and visualization, and have the skills to be able to build and deploy a platform like the one that I showed you in short notice. But we couldn't use that data because basically, that was data that did not go through ethics approval, did not go through IRB. This was a group of citizens in the private sector creating a platform in the heat of the moment. So what we had to do is we had to start over. We had to basically create platforms, submit them to the ethic board here at the University of Toulouse, and, in the case of Brazil, also in Brazil. And we launched 2 platforms, that would help us understand these ideas, better, targeted for the 2022 French presidential election and the 2022 Brazilian presidential election. This also gave us an opportunity to improve upon the idea, because instead of having proposals that came from some, think tank people over WhatsApp, like we did in Chile, we took proposals that came from the government programs of the official candidates of the election. So we had lawyers going through the government programs, curate them into sound bites, and then eventually we created platforms that were not simply aggregating preferences, but they were providing people the ability to collaboratively build a government program by combining, proposals from different candidates without them knowing which candidate was the one that gave this proposal, and this resulted in a paper that now is conditionally accepted at Nature Human Behavior. So we hope it sees the light of day before the end of this year. So we had, data from France and from Brazil during the election. We didn't get the levels of participation that we got in Chile during the mobilizations. I think that's understandable. But we did get enough participation, like over 1,000 people participating in both of them, and we're not saying that this is representative of any of these countries. This is only representative of the people that went into these platforms. And we care about that because we want to kind of, try to understand something about the preference that were elicited by a population. And in this case, we're okay to restrict our sample to these populations, like it's usual in digital participation platforms. Participation tends to skew towards male, for instance, in both France and Brazil. We reproduce that. That's a well-known fact. Our population tended to be quite educated because these platforms were released, from universities and so forth. And this is what we got for France. For instance, if you look at the preferences, ranked, by win percentage, which is one of these voting rules, similar to Borda. We, for example, plan to use 100% renewable energies by 2050 is something that people in France agreed on that was important. Increased personnel in public hospitals, people in France more or less agreed that it was important. So increasing the minimum wage, people also agreed that was important. Things that people did not agree were important: remove the TV license fee, prohibit the burkini at municipal swimming pools, and so forth. Those were at the bottom of the ranking. In Brazil, the minimum wage also is, they're at the top of the priorities of the people that participated here. Create a program that expands the guarantee of citizenships for the most vulnerable and brings universal minimum income. Invest in the management of the SAS, that's, healthcare. Again, strengthening career plans for valuing teachers. Those were the top, priorities. And on the bottom, you have the ones that people thought that were more irrelevant. But what we could do here is look beyond these measures of aggregation, and we could look at divisiveness, and we can define divisiveness using that chart that I did for Chile some time ago. So we have basically here people that identify with the left, people that identify with the right, and for instance, people in France that identify with the left, they were going for policies like prohibit any salary difference of more than 1 to 20 in a company. That was ranked quite high among people in the left, had a high win percentage, but not so high in people in the right. People in the right, for instance, they want other things like restoration of border control by France, leaving the Schengen agreement. That was a proposal on the right, but not on the left. So even though we had a very biased and small population, this seems to kind of like be working. And we can do divisiveness not only by political orientation, but by age. For instance, by dividing participants between those that are younger and older than the median and so forth. And we can do this for a number of dimensions. So we have now something that is more general. In fact, it's so general that I'm going to speed up a little bit. We can actually generalize it to an average over many possible splits of the population. So we can now calculate divisiveness without considering age or political affiliation or whether people live in the city or in the streets, on the farm, but by doing it simply, as an average of all of the splits based on whether a proposal or the other one won. And with this, we can create a measure of divisiveness that is quite general, and interestingly enough, is almost perfectly anti-correlated, like uncorrelated with the measures of agreement. So here on the x-axis, you see the preferences of people in terms of win percentage. So the x-axis will tell you who wins the election, and the y-axis tells you who polarizes the election. So for instance, you have proposals that are ranked very similar. Number 11 in France, create a constitutional assembly to pass to the Sixth Republic. It's highly ranked among the population of participants that went to our platform, but it's very divisive, And you have another proposal, for example, number 14, is not ranked as highly. Increased number of doctors in rural underserved areas is not divisive. The population is not in disagreement about that. So this divisiveness actually is telling you something that these measures of agreement are not telling you about. There is something important here that otherwise we're missing. The same in Brazil. Look at 29 and 30. These are basically ranked the same. The preservation of culture and demarcation of indigenous and Quilombas lands, that one, very divisive issue, rank almost the same as in current research related to medicine, which has the same level of support, but it's not nearly as divisive. So we were in a position that we could now start exploring these axiomatic properties. So the first one, that I'm going to focus on is this pairwise efficiency. So here you have a matrix in which each row represents a proposal, each column represents a proposal, and the value of the cell tells us how that proposal did against the other in the pairwise election. So how many times this proposal beat the other proposal when they were presented as a pair. And when you sort that matrix, you see that it draws like a gradient, and you can calculate what is the probability that a proposal that is ranked lower beats one that is ranked higher. And if this matrix would be perfect from a Condorcet perspective, this would be 100%. We get a pairwise efficiency of 81%, which is not that bad, Then when we look at the independence of relative alternatives, basically we look at the ranking of proposals, and then we calculate that ranking again by removing one proposal from this data and calculating everything again. For the top proposal, we never change the winner. And overall, we only observe some switches. These are the red lines on this matrix in which a proposal, let's say that is 29 and 30 flip, but they happen, more or less in the middle of the ranking. So again, the method is relatively robust to the independence of the relative alternatives. What is interesting is then we can grab, this matrix, we can decompose it, and here we use singular value decomposition. And when we do that, we find that this first factor, like the first eigenvector of the matrix, is much more pairwise efficient than the matrix itself. So what we have is, in some sense, the real preferences of people are the result of some preferences that are Condorcet efficient, very, transitive and ordered, and then other higher order factors, that do not have that. In fact, like this first factor, like the voting rules, they can be abstracted as the first eigenvector of these pairwise matrices, and voting rules, they change, the results a little bit, but they're going to be very highly correlated with the first eigenvector of, the pairwise matrix. And then the third factors, fourth factors, sometimes second factor, depending on the data, they start correlating more with this idea of divisiveness. So basically what we have learned here is that you have these traditional rules like Condorcet, Borda. These are variations of the first eigenvector of the preference matrix, but divisiveness, which is something that people have not looked at all, is related to these higher order eigenvectors and is therefore a natural mathematical extension for these traditional voting rules, because it's giving us this information about not how much this item is supported, but how much it will divide the population. And that is something that you want to take into consideration. It's not the same being ranked 30 with support that is non-polarizing than with support that is highly polarizing. So it was a circuitous path. We started in Chile during a revolution that caught us off guard. I really was not expecting my week to end up, the way it did on October of 2019. But, we had the team, we had the tools, we had the idea, we had the experience, we have built some platforms that were similar before, and we're able to launch a platform that threw us into a new direction. It showed me that I was wrong, that trying to find consensus was actually was not maybe the right idea at that moment. I came out a little bit later to that realization. It took me like a few weeks, but then that idea, was something that we could use in a scientific context, using data from Brazil, using data, from France, and allowed us to discover this divisiveness, this metric that goes beyond the traditional voting rules, can be defined as a conjugate for any voting rule, and allows us to understand what polarizes the population. And we have two papers, one that came out in HCAI, which is more about like the mathematical background, and another one that is forthcoming in Nature Human Behavior, that is the one that has the empirical data. Thank you.